a couple of weeks ago now, sister who's now an ancestor, now great ancestor, Mukami Kimathi, who was the wife of the great ancestor Kimathi Wawashiori, also known as Dedan Kimathi, transitioned into the ancestral realm on May 4th, and she was 96 years old, and she actually had a state funeral that was put together for her by the Kenyan government. And in many cases, many of us may not be familiar in the diaspora with Mukami Kimathi, but she was a freedom fighter, because of how she supported her husband and how she stood by him and by his side, even under duress.
Mm.
So we're talking about a sister who was captured and tortured when they were trying to find the whereabouts. We're talking about the British colonialists who were trying to find the whereabouts of her husband,
Mm-hmm.
Dedan Kimathi. And, you know, whenever we talk about our freedom fighters, we talk about their wives as well. And we talk about the important roles that they played, and also the sacrifices that they had to make to be married to men who were dedicated to trying to liberate African people.
Mm-hmm.
But in many cases, we don't give them as much praise as we should. So when we look at a sister like this sister here, we have to understand that at the time that her husband died, they had 10 children.
Mm.
So imagine being a mother of 2 sons and 8 daughters,
Mm.
young children, and just like that overnight, now you become a single parent having to raise these children on your own.
Mm.
And in many cases, many of the past members who took the oath of what the Europeans called the Mau Mau were left in poverty after Kenya gained its independence.
Mm.
And they were discarded by the Jomo Kenyatta regime. They didn't really get the credibility that they reserved until later. But we go back and we look at Kimathi Wawashiori, or was also known as Dedan Kimathi. Now, the name Dedan is a biblical name, and we know that many of our brothers and sisters who fell under colonial rule, in many cases, sometimes took on European names due to the colonialists coming in and forcing the religion on African people. So, in a lot of cases, when they would get baptized, they would take on a European name.
Mm-hmm.
But he was born Kimathi Wawashiori, and he was the field marshal, the leading field marshal of what was known as the Kiama gwitia wiathi, known as the Freedom Struggle Association.
Mm.
Now, the British called them the Mau Mau. Mau Mau doesn't mean anything in any language in Kenya. There are over 42 languages in Kenya.
Mm.
So that term Mau Mau was used as a way really to paint them as a terrorist group. And they coined that phrase so that they could market that to the rest of the world to give themselves legitimacy in what they were doing in Kenya, which was committing genocide on the Kikuyu and stealing land from Africans who had held the land and owned the land for thousands of years.
Mm.
So even when we use the term Mau Mau now, because it's what we're familiar with, we have to understand that, you know, a lot of terms that we say and understand come from a colonial period, just like the names of certain countries. In fact, Kenya itself, the name Kenya comes from Kirinyaga, which is the mountain. And when the British came in, they couldn't say Kirinyaga, so they called it Kenya. Just like Tanzania, we know that the name for Tanzania was Tanganyika. So when we look across the board, a lot of cases, you know, not only are the borders of a lot of these countries due to colonial rule, but even some words that we think are African words actually come from colonial uh, either mispronunciations or misinterpretations of certain words and terms.
Mm.
But it's really sad that Brother Dedan Kimathi does not get the the praise really that he deserves across the African continent.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've been to Uganda and Tanzania, and when you speak to Tanzanians and Ugandans, many of them are not even familiar with who Dedan Kimathi was,
Mm.
which is really a shame because Africa not only has a great ancient history, but Africa also has a great history in the struggle for African liberation in the same regard that Africans in the diaspora have a great history in the struggle for African liberation.
Mm-hmm.
This is a unification or a history that could unify Africans everywhere, but in a lot of cases we still operate from uh, the individualism of our specific ethnic groups,
Mm.
which causes us not to really want to learn about other Africans, important Africans across the continent. And this is not everybody. You do have a lot of Africans who are African centered, African nationalists, or if you want to use the term Pan Africanists, and they do have an educational awareness, of African freedom fighters. But the reason why Dedan Kimathi is very important is because many of the African countries who gained their independence, you have to look at how Europeans recalibrated their control of African countries during the times of colonialism because of the quote unquote Mau Mau or the Freedom Struggle Association.
Mm.
Because of what they did in their revolution against the British, it struck fear in French, the Germans, the Dutch, and also the other countries that the British had control over. They didn't want that same type of revolution to replicate itself in other countries. It's no different than, in the United States, you have Nat Turner's revolt in 1831, and then you have a recalibration, which leads to uh, eventually Black people being freed in this country. And you can go back also to the Haitian Revolution. So all of these things stack up to how Europeans then respond because of the fear that they have of Africans fighting back. And they feared Dedan Kimathi so much that when they executed him, they actually had somebody or a group of these house guards. These were actually the traitors who were assisting the Europeans in not only fighting against the Mau Mau, but also capturing and killing or helping to kill Dedan Kimathi. They had these race traitors stand by and guard the unmarked grave that they buried Dedan Kimathi in because they were afraid that he was going to resurrect. So, of course, when Kenya gained its independence and Jomo Kenyatta became the president, during his presidency, many of the former members of the Mau Mau, many of them became homeless. They were not given their land back. Many of them were just left stranded, and many of them fell into poverty. And it was at least 40 years before any recognition took place, and that didn't happen until Mwai Kibaki became the president of Kenya, who was a Kikuyu brother who was from the same region of Nyeri as Dedan Kimathi that actually gave recognition to the Mau Mau, and the respect was paid to Dedan Kimathi as a national figure.
Mm.
So prior to this, during the presidency of Daniel Mwai back in 1990, Nelson Mandela traveled to Kenya and he requested to see the remains or see the gravesite of Dedan Kimathi. And the Kenyan government was embarrassed because they didn't know where it was. Even though at this time his wife was still living, they had no record of where she was.
Mm.
So it took somebody like Mandela to come in and pose the question for them to actually start to think about how they actually got in the position of being an independent country by having people who were willing to put their lives on the line for them. And during Kabaka's presidency, he did a few things. The first thing he did was he erected a statue in honor of Dedan Kimathi. This is a statue that's actually in Nairobi, that you can see if you actually travel to Nairobi. And he also built a home for Dedan Kimathi's widow, Mukami Kimathi, and also he, helped her out with money and food and transportation and these things. But at this time, I mean, think about the struggle that she had to go through for 30, 40 years, 50 years of raising children by herself with limited resources, only for the government to step in at a later point in her life as an elder, to take care of her, how she should have been taken care of, and how the Freedom Struggle Association should have been taken care of during the time that they actually helped the country get its independence. They should have been treated as national heroes. And here you have men who fight for you, for your freedom and your independence, and you cast them aside because you are afraid of disappointing your colonial masters at the time. So
Mm.
essentially, you're striking a deal with the British government to neglect your own brothers. And Jomo Kenyatta is Kikuyu himself.
Mm.
So every year that I travel back to Kenya, I go to Dedan Kimathi's village in Nyeri. This is actually near the location where he was actually caught, where he was shot, and he was actually caught. And in 2019, the government actually erected a statue during the time of Uhuru Kenyatta. They erected a statue in the location of where he was shot and captured. And on this plaque that you see here, there's a quote from Dedan Kimathi that says, "It's better to die on our feet than live on our knees for fear of colonial rule."
Mm.
So, many of us famously use part of this quote today, not knowing where it came from, which is the first part. It's better to die on our feet than live on our knees.
Yeah, James Brown has it in his song,
Hmm.
believe it or not. Mm.
But that quote actually came from Dedan Kimathi.
Wow.
So I just wanted to take time to, pay homage to his wife and to uh, spread the word about, her transitioning, becoming an ancestor, and really say that we really need to keep up with more of our freedom fighters. You're not going to see news about her transitioning in the mainstream media because Dedan Kimathi is not an ancestor that they want you to remember.
Mm-hmm.
He's an ancestor that even directly after his death, they were afraid that the Kikuyu would build a shrine from his grave.
Yeah.
So, uh, you know, many of the Mau Mau that still live in Kenya now, Uh, I was speaking with one brother a couple of years ago who was one of the oath takers, and he was telling me stories about how everything happened during this time. And a lot of people don't realize, when we talking about, freedom and liberation, it's not just the sacrifice of potentially losing your life. It's living through the pain and the suffering of your comrades being killed, of people around you and you and yourself being tortured, people in your family being killed, people being raped. All of these things that, we look back on documentaries and we talk about them, we discuss them, but just talking to this brother and seeing that look in his eyes, it's not something that real people who've been through it even want to discuss because they have to relive that pain again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
But
I remember reading a couple of years ago. I think it may have been, about her, and I think the article was talking about how the British repeatedly tortured her because they believed that she knew where her husband was hiding.
mm-hmm,
And I'd say that this brother, Dedan Kimathi, was probably one of the most feared Africans in the history of the struggle against colonialism.
that's right.
Maybe the most feared.
Mm-hmm,
Maybe the most feared
mm-hmm,
because at that time, uh, no other country that was under colonialism at that time, when we're talking here about the 1950s, 50, 54, 55. I think he was killed in 57. Uh, there's no one else engaged in armed struggle
mm-hmm,
at that time. So uh, this brother was now esteemed ancestor was such a powerful and inspiring and enlightening figure that people rallied around him
mm-hmm,
to fight to the death. And when they captured his wife, she was immensely tortured, but she refused under all that torture to, give up his location. So she should be honored, really and truly. And when I do libations, I always call a lot of sisters, and sometimes, depending on what type of libations I'm doing, I always try to call out, the what I call the power couples, in which, in a lot of instances, we don't know that, say, necessarily the name, for example, of, I don't anyway, the husband of a Manorinus, or you know people like that, who are engaged in struggle.
mm-hmm.
But I always try to recognize uh, the sisters as well as the brothers, because in a lot of instances the brothers wouldn't be able to do what they did, without the sisters. So, uh, but in a lot of instances, the sisters themselves are, in fact, the revolutionary leaders, and they should be recognized. I remember when we were supporting Frelimo, Samora Michelle. His first wife was named Josina. She was I think she might have been a nurse or worked something in the medical field. But of course, being in Frelimo, she went under guerrilla warfare training and was, by all accounts, a fierce soldier on the battlefield. And this is something that you often, women on the battlefield is something that you don't deal with a lot. But a lot of women fought alongside Amilcar Cabral, for example. fought
Mm-hmm.
alongside, Samora Michelle and Frelimo. I mean, this is not uncommon at all, in African struggle.
Just this past December, Mukami Kimathi, there was an article that came out where she was requesting that the government help locate the remains of Dedan Kimathi. In her own words, she stated, "I want to see his remains before I die," because she knew that she was getting ready to transition.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it's really a shame that that information was, because we know that that information has been passed down to someone, but out of fear of them not wanting to say, or fear of the consequence, um, it's still really unknown where this ancestor is buried.
Yeah, and it was the same with Thomas Sankara. His burial site remained a secret for almost 20 years before it was revealed. And you look at Patrice Lumumba, they just totally disposed of his body, in some
Mhm.
type of sulfuric acid or something like that. Uh,
So
and
the European knows in some cases more about the African than we know about ourselves.
they have an inordinate fear of African spirituality. Okay, I mean, as long as you talking about Jesus Christ or whatever,
Mhm.
that's okay. But in terms of when you go deep in African spirituality, like Mbuyu no Honda and people like that, their fear is off the chain. They are literally afraid that
Mhm.
people are gonna rise, from their death, from the grave, and kill
Mhm.
them. And it wouldn't necessarily be them, but it would be their spirit,
Mhm.
which has penetrated other people, and they operate with that same level of courage, no fear, no fear. If I gotta face my death, then that's what I gotta do.
That's right.
But I'm going to fight, for my people to be liberated, and it's something they don't understand. They don't understand, and there's a tremendous fear of what happens if this becomes, a mass-based consciousness. Tremendous fear,
That's right.
no question about it. No question about it.
Well, brothers and sisters, this has been another edition of the African Liberation Media Show. Thank you for watching. Please, please leave your comments down in the comment section and give us a like on this video if you thought it was good, and subscribe to our channel for more videos in the future. Until next time, I'll be for Hodier.
Habibi for Hodie.